The actual definition of a joint venture is the opposite of a security. So yes, if everyone in that deal is actively involved and they're all rolling up their sleeves and they're all contributing to the return of the investment, then by definition, it's not a security because it doesn't even fit the definition of a security, right? So, but the key there is everyone has to be actively involved. You can't have anybody just writing a check and either doing no work and getting a return or doing minimal work compared to how much they're inviting.
Your network is your net worth. Come listen to some of the most successful people I know share invaluable knowledge, stories, and advice in real estate, business, and beyond. This is Weiss Advice. Whether you want to take your business or personal life to the next level, look no further. Welcome back to another episode of Weiss Advice. I am your host, as always, Yona Weiss. I am so happy to be here today. Beautiful day, and I'm grateful to be joined by the one and only Mauricio Rauld. What is going on, my friend?
How you doing, my friend? Good to be back and good to see you. It's been a while since we've had the pleasure of seeing each other. So excited and looking forward to the day.
Absolutely. This is great. Always love to bring on experts in their respective fields. And Mauricio is just that. He's actually, just to give our listeners a little context, Mauricio is the founder and CEO of Premier Law Group. So he's a syndication attorney. What's a syndication attorney, right? We'll talk a little bit about that later, but essentially he's dealing with multifamily, with real estate investors who are doing syndications, who want to make sure that their securities laws are in place and everything is totally legal. Okay. You got to have someone like him on your team if you want to do things the right way. So Mauricio, I'm really excited to be joining you. I've first came across you many years ago. We're doing some from flip chart, stuff. And I'm like, wow, this is really fascinating. I didn't even know what's a 506C, what's a 506B. And I think, many years ago, that was the first time I really came across you discussing it. And it's become so many people to this day. And I credit you to a lot of it is, really understand some of the intricacies of some of these securities laws. Just to others, it's like, well, what is that? I don't even know what that's talking about.
Yeah. I appreciate that. That's the very kind words, but yeah, I kind of get to be known as the flip chart guy because that's what I use. I don't use PowerPoints. I got my little markers and, my job, I see my job as just trying to make, securities laws are very, opaque and nebulous and really kind of convoluted and complicated. And so my job is to just try and take that and just make it as easy to understand it as possible.
Yeah.
People often joke that I'm one of the few attorneys that actually speaks English. And so that's always a compliment in my mind. And so that's what I try and do. I try and take these complicated matters and just try and put them into, 3 easy steps or 4 tips or something like that so that people can actually start getting their mind around it as opposed to just looking at all these statutes and regulations and saying, what in the world, what is this and why do I even have to bother?
Absolutely. And you definitely make it more palatable because some of these complicated topics can be very difficult to wrap your head around, and having someone like yourself simplify them in a way that, everyone can grasp is definitely a huge benefit for everyone.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah, looking forward to talking about some of these complicated things and making them easy to understand.
Sure. Tell us a little bit about how you got into, this niche of what you're doing now. I mean, what were you doing before that? How do you get your start in law? And maybe just give a little background on how you got involved in the real estate world.
Yeah, I've actually been doing securities work since the very beginning. Once I left law school, I did my law degree here at Loyola downtown Los Angeles and did what every aspiring lawyer wants to do. And I went to work for a large firm, a litigation firm, where I did a lot of securities work and some maritime. We were in Long Beach, which is where all the Long Beach, LA port is. But my job there was different. Even though I was in the securities business, I was, again, litigation. So I would represent all the brokerage houses like JP Morgan and Merrill Lynch and American Express. And basically every time they got sued, we would represent them. So I was in not necessarily trial all the time, but we were doing depositions and motions in front of judges all the time.
Right.
And that was a lot of fun, but I recognized fairly early that's not what I wanted to do for the rest of my life, even though it was an amazing, amazing place to work. And I was fortunate enough, I'll give you the condensed version because this can get pretty long, but I was fortunate enough to come across Robert Helms and Russell Gray over at the Real Estate Guys through the Rich Dad book, which I know a lot of your listeners have read, the purple little book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. He had, interestingly enough, I'd read his book, obviously, just like everyone listening in, changed their lives and just kind of, it was a huge paradigm shift. And it was just an amazing book. And luckily for me, I literally he was doing, and I just heard it the other day, Robert Kiyosaki was doing a radio drop-in for the real estate guys. It's about, just basically say, hey, this is Robert Kiyosaki. If you're interested in investing in real estate, check out the real estate guys. They really know what they're talking about. And again, I just read the book. And so that's how I got connected to the guys, went to their events, and long story short, became their in-house counsel. And that's really where I transitioned from the litigation side over to the transactional and helping people raise capital, because that's what those guys were doing, Robert and Russ, back in the day. I mean, this is 15 years ago now, literally no internet, right? I think social media was just starting out. So we literally were doing live events, presentations with 50, 100 people in a room. And I was there with, all the legal documents and PPM literally printed out and going through it with the investors and collecting signatures and collecting a check, and then everybody would go to deposit. So that's really where I cut my teeth back again, like 15 years ago when I first started being general counsel for the guys. And then after that, I was doing that for a couple of years and decided to start my own firm. Kept the real estate guys obviously as a very close and VIP client as they are today. But then we started to help a lot of their followers and people in their world with their syndications. The syndication was starting to become a big deal. Right. And so started helping them do that. And it wasn't really until I think really 2013, which is when these new really then the last really huge updates happened, allowing people to start advertising and doing things that they couldn't do before, where the industry really took off. And we were lucky enough to kind of ride that wave. And as we were talking about before we got on, we still are riding that wave. Right? It's pretty incredible ride that the multifamily or real estate in general has had over the last 15 years.
That's awesome. Yeah, love the real estate guys. We actually had Russ on the show many moons ago, and he was, just blew me away. Like literally, like drinking from a fire hose, like that's what he was talking about. And this was still in the early days of COVID, I think. And he was just talking about the economy, and I think he's spot on. I mean, go back to 12, 14 months or whatever, however long ago it was that we recorded that, maybe 18 months ago. And he really spot on with some of his advice. So very fortunate, obviously, to be part of that world. Obviously, you spent time with them and doing their cruises probably and doing their trips.
Yeah. We just pivoted because, everybody has to pivot, right? That's probably one of the lessons that Russ was talking about back then. And so the guys also pivoted. They used to do an annual conference, or not a seminar, but a sort of a gathering of some high level players. And it just happened to be on a cruise ship. We never saw the cruise ship. I mean, we never did anything. We were in the basement in whatever conference rooms they were from the minute we woke up to the minute we went to bed. But it was called the Summit at Sea. And again, it was just a really high level conference. And of course, when COVID hit, cruises even today are not really at the top of everyone's list. So we pivoted, and now we do it on an island in Belize. And so now we call it the Summit on Sand as opposed to Summit at Sea.
That's so cool.
We just did the first one last year, and we're doing it again this year. But it's been a great ride with those guys. It's just stand-up guys, and really fortunate to have come across their paths, and just super thankful.
Sure. So because I have you here and you are an expert, I can't be remiss to not pick your brain on some of these. I'm not paying for a consultation right now, so feel free to hold back whatever you normally would. But tell us a little bit. Obviously, there have been some recent updates as well. There always are, and the government is always trying to shake things up and make sure people are compliant. Before we get to that, let me tell us some of the biggest pitfalls that you've seen. Obviously, you have a lot of clients. You have a lot of people who are newbies or new investors who really don't know what they're doing. Which is why they'll come to someone like you. But you also have very experienced people who may just not know what, the right things to do. So what are some pitfalls that you see a lot of people who are in the real estate world that you are able to correct them on?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because I think, and we alluded to it a little bit at the beginning, but probably the biggest mistake I see is investors not recognizing or realizing that they're actually in the business of issuing securities, because, why would they? They're just buying a piece of property, especially on the lower end. If they're just buying a duplex or a fourplex or a 10-unit apartment building, and they put together 2 or 3 of their buddies, why is the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, why are they even in my world? Like, it wouldn't even cross your mind. And they just don't realize that the definition of a security is extremely broad. And it involves basically any time you're taking money from passive investors, where you're the one generating the return, that's a security. And it doesn't matter if it's a LLC or a tenants in common or a profit sharing agreement, a side letter, the structure itself doesn't matter. Are you taking money from people, and are you then going out and doing all the work and just giving them a return? When you do that, it's a security. And so that's when things get a little bit more complicated and hairy, because now you're inside this complex web of securities laws. And at that point, your cost of doing business goes up significantly, because now you've got to comply with not only federal securities laws, but also state securities laws. And that's what we do. We help investors navigate those landmines.
That can be extremely challenging, but I see that. I can definitely hear that people wouldn't necessarily think of themselves as even involved in that whatsoever. Is a workaround, just out of curiosity, a workaround to that would be, if it is literally like a small deal like that, where it, not necessarily everyone is passive, meaning if people participated and it's more like a JV structure, so to speak, where people are actually participating and doing something, does that take it out of the realm of the securities?
It does. And this is an interesting topic, because yes, if it is what we call a joint venture, a legitimate joint venture, the actual definition of a joint venture is the opposite of a security. So yes, if everyone in that deal is actively involved and they're all rolling up their sleeves and they're all contributing to the return of the investment, then by definition, it's not a security, because it doesn't even fit the definition of a security, right? So, but the key there is everyone has to be actively involved. You can't have anybody just writing a check and either doing no work and getting a return, or doing minimal work compared to how much they're inviting. So you generally want to keep those to less than 5 people, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm, by the way, I wouldn't call them investors. I would call them partners, because that's really what you're doing. You're starting a business essentially, and you're going to have 3, 4, 5 people contribute capital. Theoretically, it all should be proportionate. Probably everybody should be on the loan, but everybody should have some level of expertise, because, if you have somebody, you bring in the little old lady who has no real estate experience at all, how are you going to argue that they are contributing somehow to the venture? So probably the most important point, though, when you're talking about joint ventures and securities and, which one is it, you don't get to make that choice. As I mentioned again, anytime you're taking money from passive investors where the returns are generated by your efforts, you're issuing securities. It doesn't matter how you structure it. So just because this is one of the big pitfalls, just because you call something a joint venture doesn't mean it is a joint venture. We're going to look past titles. I'm going to see what exactly is going on here. How many people are involved? Who's writing checks? Who's doing what? Who's generating returns? If somebody's getting an acquisition fee or an asset management fee or some kind of a sweat equity, kind of what we call carried interest, then that starts to look a lot like, wait a minute, why are you getting these fees? It must be because you're doing some extra work. You're the ringleader. Mm-hmm. And if you're the ringleader doing most of the work, that's going to be problematic. So the important thing to remember is you don't get to choose. Just calling it a joint venture doesn't make it a joint venture, but there are ways to change your facts, right? If you've got a certain fact pattern that makes it look like a security, then there are ways to change those fact patterns, meaning, well, if you've got one person who's passive, well, let's make them active. Let's make them a co-manager. Let's make them in charge of something, so that we can then not only argue, but that we can see that the returns are not generated by Yona's efforts or my efforts, but it's everybody collectively chipping in. That
makes a lot of sense. I appreciate you bringing that point up, because and is that something that you can even backtrack at a certain point, or does it need to be in place from like the very beginning?
Once you're selling securities and violate those securities laws, it's, I think, impossible to put that cat back in the bag, right? The cat's already out of the bag. So that's why you want to discuss that early on in the process. And, we're pretty upfront. So, if it's a joint venture, we have somebody that we refer it out to. And the key is to make sure that somebody who's doing the joint venture knows enough about securities law. They're not going to be an expert, but enough where there's something maybe a little bit of a red flag, and they can shoot an email to a colleague or something that does have that expertise, because it does happen where it is a fine line.
Sure.
It's a very fine line. So you could be doing a joint venture, but some provision in there may put it across the line, just over the line to its security. So you want your attorney to bring it back over the line, to bring it back into the joint venture space, because again, the facts will dictate whether it's a security or a joint venture.
Gotcha. For sure. And have you seen, or to what extent have you seen actual, litigation around this, or actual challenges from the SEC, things like that? I mean, from my world, which is more, the consolidation, the tax thing, it's very infrequent that people would actually get audited. It's not something that's very common. However, we want to make sure that we're doing everything in the right way from the get-go, right? In the correct manner. And so that everything will pass the test in the event of an audit, obviously. But I mean, is it the same kind of idea within the securities world?
Well, a couple of things to think about here, and this is a good point. You've got to remember that we talked about earlier, we've had a really good run, right? And so these issues that pop up, usually the SEC isn't actively going out and looking for people violating laws, right? What ends up happening, something goes wrong, right? The deal goes south, people start losing money. and then they contact the regulators. It's usually actually, especially in a smaller deal, it'll probably be your state regulator, not necessarily the SEC at the federal level. But if you're like me, I'm a California resident, and I complain to the California Securities Division, and that's how it gets going. And obviously, we've had such a great run in real estate over the last 13 years. What is it now? 13, 14 years now since everything kind of went south. And so, everybody's kind of had that golden rule defense, or, we just either got not lucky, but when things are going great, nobody's complaining, right? And so my concern is always that when things don't even have to go south, but when you get to a point where things aren't just like throw a dart, at the map and you're going to make a ton of money, and when it actually becomes harder and harder, and if things start going south and people start losing money, that's when they're going to pick up the phone. Or even if they don't think about picking up the phone, they're going to run into an attorney who's going to say, hey, you know what? We can get your money back because that really is a security. They didn't do all the proper disclosure. They basically gave you what's called an unregistered security. We can go after them to get your money back. And that's ultimately the penalty, right? I wrote a book called The 5 Things Every Syndicator Must Know to Stay Out of Jail. You're not going to go to jail. I picked that title on purpose to make it, because I think a lot of people are not taking these securities laws seriously enough. So I wanted to make that impact. But the main penalty, so to speak, for not following these rules is rescission. So you're essentially guaranteeing your quote unquote investors or partners. So they give you $50,000, the deal goes south, and it turns out you didn't follow the rules. They could get their $50,000 back plus interest. So why would you be in the business of guaranteeing your investors money? You don't want to do that. So that's why you want to follow the laws. But again, I said, to get back to your original question, over the last 13 years, everything's been going great. So the SEC isn't actively going after people,
right.
But
it's only when complaints are filed.
People complain, that's when the audits start.
Right. And definitely seen in the news, there are always cases where, people are committing fraud and doing things maliciously. I mean, not every mom and pop syndicating group is trying to do anything wrong. They may just be making some mistakes, right? They just may not be doing what they should be doing, but there are others that are more predatory, unfortunately, out there.
Yeah, and that's why I say the SEC. The SEC is usually going after, number one, fraud, where you're actually intentionally defrauding investors, putting up Ponzi schemes or what have you, and obviously larger dollar amounts, right? I mean, Is it possible for the SEC to go after you because you collected $300,000? Maybe, but they're probably not too interested. They want to go after people who are doing $100 million scams or $50 million scams. Right. But again, I'm not in the business of trying to figure out whether you're going to get caught or whatever. I'd rather you do it properly and not have to worry about any of these issues. And that's kind of what my job is. Yeah.
No, it's unfortunate to see, though, when you have a lot of these news stories come out. It really just gives a bad name to the syndication world, which in my opinion is a great space. And I think most of the people are, very sincere and very good, well-meaning and well-acting individuals.
Yeah. When you think of it that way, I mean, we've been talking a lot about, I know you're on LinkedIn quite a bit. And if folks out there aren't on LinkedIn, they're missing out. Maybe we shouldn't be giving out the secrets to Yona, but there's been a lot of discussion on LinkedIn about, just providing value and really focusing on your investor, right? A lot of people are just like, what's in it for me? Or I need the money. I need this. And in exchange, I'll give you something. And when you start thinking about it as I'm actually providing a service to the investors, I'm solving some problem they have, whether it's a tax problem, this is where the great tax benefits come in from real estate, which is where you come in, or whether they just need a better return or they don't want to be in the stock market. So you're actually providing your investors a very valuable service. And that's what people should focus on. How can I deliver value to that passive investor, not what's in it for me? Speaking of Russell Gray, he's got a very famous quote that could potentially take a few minutes to say, but I'll give you the Cliff Notes version. When it comes to selling, when it comes to raising capital, it's never, ever, 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 ever about you, right? It's never about you. It's always about what does the investor need? How can I satisfy those specific needs? And the better you get at that, the easier it's going to be for you to raise capital.
For sure. Yeah. It's all about adding value and focusing on the other, for sure. And LinkedIn, guys, if you aren't listening, if you're not connected with Mauricio, check him out on there. It's got some incredible content. You'll see what we're talking about with the flip charts. If you go on LinkedIn.
I've actually branded it now. I call it Flip Chart Fridays.
Oh, right.
It was such a nice thing. I figured, hey, let's just start doing some iteration. So it's actually been so popular. I think I'm going to start doing a whiteboard Wednesday, maybe more of the sort of a syndication basics 101 topics, do it on the whiteboard on Wednesdays, and then do my usual flip charts on Friday. So
that's great.
We'll see how that goes.
Go for it. Yeah, that'd be awesome. I know you'd probably get a lot of response from that, for sure.
Yeah.
Is there anything news or anything like that's happening now? I know there's constantly updates, there's constantly things going on that maybe our listeners may not know about.
Yeah. The last year, there were a ton of updates. I mean, we've been talking quite a bit about it over the last 12 to 18 months, but the one there's probably two, and don't have to go spend too much time on it. But one is this idea of expanding the definition of an accredited investor, which I think was very interesting back then, and it kind of stalled. But now I have a quick update for you guys. But the idea was, an accredited investor, knowing if somebody's accredited or not is important, because some of these deals that people are raising for are limited to only accredited investors, and so it's very important to understand whether you're accredited, because you may not be eligible. You may love the syndication world, but if you're a non-accredited investor, that might limit the opportunities that you have. And an accredited investor is just a high net worth individual who has either $1 million in net worth, excluding residents, or has earned $200,000 the last couple of years with a reasonable expectation of earning that this year. But there's been this debate as to, is really financial, wherewithal really the right metric? And they finally came out and said, no, we're going to start expanding this definition so that you can actually get certified. So if you can take a course, pass an exam, we'll license you, or not license, we'll give you a certification that, hey, this person's smart enough, I guess, to be considered an accredited investor. But the idea was when that law passed, that they were going to start rolling out these certification programs. That hasn't happened. Right now, the only certification is if you're an investment advisor. So if you have a Series 7 or 65 or 82, that makes you an accredited investor. But just literally last week, I think it was Tuesday of last week or Thursday of last week, the SEC had a meeting. They convened and spent the entire day talking about this accredited investor update, and has now submitted it for additional comments. So it is on their agenda. It looks like it's making some movements. We'll probably hear some certifications here in the next 6 months, because they kind of do their agenda rolling over the next 6 months. So that's going to be exciting, because we don't know what it's going to look like, but hopefully, a weekend course, or, you just maybe you just study on your own and you take an exam like you do with a Series 7 and pass the exam, and boom, now you're accredited, and you've got, not only do you have options to invest in other people's deal, but it's also nice for syndicators who can then educate their limited partners and say, look, I know you're not accredited, so why don't you go through this process, and now you're going to be eligible for my deals.
That's great. And that's definitely something that I remember, the changes to the tests and things like that, the accreditation process. Lowering that bar really just makes it, more available for more people to invest. And I think that definition to me never really made sense to the extent, especially if you're talking about, so especially a lot of these crowdfunding platforms, et cetera, where you need to be accredited, but the minimum investment is like $1,000, right?
Right. That's right. So yeah. A lot of those crowdfundings, they're taking $500, $1,000, $5,000 investments. Yeah.
But you need to have a net worth of $1 million to invest $1,000. Like, it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And they haven't really tinkered with it. I think that came out in 1982. And that, by the way, that more and more people are becoming accredited, just because $1 million isn't what it used to be, right? Like back in 1982, $1 million was some real money, and 200 grand was a lot of money. But yeah, so look out for that probably in the next, I'm going to guess the next, not 3 months, because there's a comment period. It's usually a 30-day comment period. Then they got to review it. But I'm guessing they'll come out with some stuff here in the next 6 months. And that might open up some additional doors for people to become eligible for some of these deals. So that's kind of an exciting thing going on.
That's awesome. That's really great. I'm glad that I asked that question, because I wasn't aware that they were continuing updating that law, but it makes sense, because we need it. Right? A lot of people need that.
That's up there. And the one that's disappointing that's not on there is that there was also a proposed rule to be able to start paying referral fees. Essentially, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but there was a new finder rule that would actually allow people to refer investors to other people and get paid a commission, which right now you can't. And that was a proposed rule that I thought was going to pass, 6 months later. But then with the new administration, that didn't go anywhere. We've been kind of trying to find out where it's at. We've kind of had dead ends. But again, the SEC just came out with their agenda for the next 6 months, and that's not on the agenda. So that's not going anywhere. People are waiting. If people are holding their breath for that rule to come out, it's not going to happen. I don't think it's going to happen in this administration, but that's stalled quite a bit. But one's stalled, one's moving forward.
Yeah, that's disappointing. That would be a good one to have in there, because
go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead. It'd make your life easier, I'm sure. But because I remember our conversation when we met a couple of years back about the challenge of trying to make connections and trying to bring people together on deals, and then any remuneration, it gets very complicated. Well, probably not so complicated. You can't do it, right? But
you can't do it. It gets complicated because people are trying to figure out, how do I do this? How do I do that? Because there is a gap. And that's really why this proposal came out, because, you're supposed to hire a broker dealer. Here's the dilemma. You're supposed to use broker dealers because you need a license to go raise money. The problem is broker dealers don't do anything for less than $25 or $50 million. So you got all these smaller investors raising 1, 2, 5, 10 million. that may want access to broker dealers, but they can't find them. And so this was meant to sort of bridge that gap. And I do believe eventually it'll pass, but unfortunately, I don't think it's going to happen. Probably not even this year.
All right. Well, in the meantime, we'll keep our fingers crossed. Hope that something happens there. Let's jump. I know time flies over here, but
yeah.
Any other like points, anything else you want to bring up here that we may have not mentioned before we get to the final four?
We've been talking about it lately, and not too many people have been talking about it, but there was also a rule that came out earlier last year, in March of last year, that actually allows syndicators to start raises under one particular exemption, specifically a 506B, and literally pivot mid-raise. So halfway through the raise, you can actually stop that 506B, pivot to a 506C, and then start advertising your raise. And that's been something that not too many people have been talking about. We've had some clients do it in-house, but I'm starting to put a little bit more content in there. And that's obviously something that's very, very interesting to many. So I probably just in the interest of time, you could probably just swing by LinkedIn and check some of that content out. If you're not following Yona, please follow him. I get a ton of value from Yona's post too. You're pretty active in LinkedIn too. It's just, LinkedIn in general is just a great community for syndicators. I would highly recommend real estate investors and syndicators to hop on over there. Absolutely.
Yeah, check that out. And we'll make sure to put your contact info and your website and everything in the show notes so people can know where to find more about this information. So I'm sure you have a lot more content on that there. Let's jump in. Final four. Mauricio, you ready?
Oh man, nervous.
What's the worst job that you ever had?
We were talking about that. I haven't had too many jobs, luckily, but I think my first ever job, I worked at a garage, literally a mechanics shop or whatever. And I was just sweeping floors and cleaning up grease and, that's probably the worst. I mean, granted, it was my first job. I was probably excited to be making, $3 an hour or whatever it was. And you learn quite a bit, but just working in that, me, I don't want grease under my fingernails, but that was my first gig, sweeping floors and cleaning up oil spills in a mechanics garage. So that's probably the worst one.
Yeah. We learned very quickly from our first job, what it is that we do and do not want to do forward.
Yeah.
What's a book you've read that's given you a paradigm shift?
There's two that come to mind, actually. One is, everybody's probably heard of the book. Well, actually, hopefully everybody's heard of both of these. One is the book, The E-Myth, right? And so the E-Myth talks about just, not working in your business, but spending more and more time working on your business. And there's actually one specific for attorneys. So if there's any attorneys out there listening, there's an E-Myth for attorneys. And so that was a big paradigm list because a lot of things, as I'm building my firm, thinking, well, I need a lawyer. And it turns out, well, no, you don't really need a lawyer to do a lot of these things. There are very experienced paralegals, for example, or admins that could do that, so that was one big paradigm. And then the one that I struggle the most with, which is probably very similar to this one, is Who Not How, I believe is the name of the title from Dan Sullivan. So, and it's all about just when you need to do something, don't figure out how am I going to pull this off, but identifying the person who can do that for you. So it's got a little bit about sort of the delegation piece of it, but just understanding that when you have a task, and it's a big one, don't try and figure out how to do it. Try and figure out who's the right person to do it for you. Absolutely.
Yeah. This book has come up recently several times, and it's moving higher and higher on my reading list.
Should. It's a quick read.
Yeah.
And by the way, Dan speaks the truth because he didn't write the book. Right? His co-author is the one who wrote the book. Because again, who not how.
There you go. That's awesome. Living it, yeah, not just preaching it.
Yep.
Third question: what's a skill or talent that you would like to learn?
You're looking at it, I think if we're doing video over my shoulder, I have a guitar that's been sitting there collecting dust for a while. And I've been stuck in the beginner stage for a while. I'm probably an advanced beginner. And it's not rocket science. I just need to practice. But I would love to become an accomplished guitar player where I could, I've got so many friends who are an amazing guitar. That would be a lot of fun for me. And it's been on my list for a while.
There you go. It's awesome. A lot of fun to play musical instruments. So wish you luck on that.
Thank you.
And you already have the guitar, so you're already 50% the way there, right?
That's right.
Fourth and final question: what does success mean to you?
I like to use a definition that Jim Rohn, the great Jim Rohn, one of my earlier mentors who unfortunately passed away, it's about 10 years now. His definition of success was the continual unfolding of the design of your own life and pulling it off. And that gets translated into designing whatever life you want. So setting goals, having a vision, all that great stuff, and then actually executing and pulling that off. So that's different for everyone. But if you can set goals and just kind of imagine what you want to do and you actually execute and pull that off, then you are a smashing success. And that's kind of the way I've been living my life. I write down what I want. And when I accomplish it, whatever that is, that's what I would consider successful.
That's awesome. I love that. I don't think I ever heard that definition from Jim Rohn. And I've read some of his work also.
Success is the continual unfolding of the design of your own personal life and pulling it off. And then he tells a story. Look, if your goal is to retire and retire into the woods and feed the squirrels, and you pull that off, you are a smashing success.
That's awesome. Figuring out is the hardest part, though, right? Figuring out what that is, what your life's goal is supposed to be.
Well, there's a great book called Vision Casting, which may be able to help you try to figure that part out.
Okay. Well, there you go. I'll put that in the show notes as well. And Mauricio, how can our listeners find you or reach out to you? Obviously, you already mentioned LinkedIn, which hopefully everyone has done by now. Yeah,
YouTube is also, I'm really growing the YouTube channel. So Mauricio Rauld, I'm just dropping, multiple videos now every week, and I'm trying to get once a day. And that's probably the easiest. And of course, my website, premierlawgroup.net, always can connect directly with me there. But any of the social media platforms, I'll be spending some time on.
Awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time today. It's incredible how much you can pack into a half an hour, but I think I learned a tremendous amount. I'm very grateful for you taking the time out.
I appreciate you having me again, and looking forward to the next one.
Yeah, God willing, we'll make it happen. And to all our listeners, thank you for joining us all the way till the end. Remember, until next time, the best advice comes only when you ask. Real quick, I have one question for you. Did you like this episode? If you did, I want to ask you a huge favor. See, the biggest thing that helps this podcast grow and that will spread this message to the whole world is that if you leave a review, a rating, and subscribe to the podcast. What that does is it basically tells the platforms that this podcast is out on is that you like my stuff and I'm doing something right. So take a few seconds out of your day, hit that subscribe button, leave a rating or review. I would be extremely grateful. Also, I want to hear from you guys. So I want to hear some feedback. If you have any questions for future episodes, please find me on LinkedIn. Send me a DM, a connection request, Yona Weiss, and I'd love to hear from you.